Yes, so as you can see, our title for this afternoon is Thoughtful Eating, which is a combination, as Phillips said, of research over the past few months. And so what we're really going to be focusing on this afternoon is our food systems, by which I mean how our food is produced and what we choose to eat, as well as specifically on eating itself. So before we begin, I just want to note that we're focusing primarily on the UK and its context with it, and it's sitting within a global context in our food systems, and that this is very much building on what has already previously been said. So you'll pick up threads already. And I also just want to, from the outset, acknowledge that I know that many people have a complex and sometimes difficult relationship with food, and so I just want to acknowledge that can be sometimes difficult to talk about as well. So to start thinking about food, eating, and our food systems, I want to, of course, start with relationships. From the shops that we purchase our food from, the people who produce our food, and those who process, transport, package, and stack the shelves, eating is inherently relational. And eating also places us, as we've heard, directly in relationship with God and with creation. And so we've been using a diagram to help us really think about this. This isn't from us, this is the work of Professor Chris Wright. But yeah, it's a really helpful diagram to help us understand how we relate to God and the non-human creation. So, first off, we begin the relationship between us and God. Genesis tells us the story of how God created humans from the dust of the earth. He made them fearfully and wonderfully, emphasizing their unique identity as image bearers of God himself. Humans were made to be in relationship with God, to glorify and to worship him. God is also in relationship with the non-human creation, separate and distinct from humans. And by the non-human creation, we mean the animals, the plants, the rivers, the weather systems, and the rocks. We often use the term environment to sum up all these members of creation. God affirms the goodness of the non-human creation outside of human input. And as we've heard throughout the whole day, this is evident throughout the Bible. In Genesis chapter 1, before God created humans, the intrinsic value of the non-human creation is affirmed. God calls it good, he delights in it, and cares for it. Similarly, in the book of Job, which is a reflection on human suffering, God challenges Job to cast his mind to the beauty and to the awe of creation. And this is highlighted in chapter 38, verses 25-27, which says, "Who cuts a channel for the torrents of rain, a path for the thunderstorm, to water a land where no one lives, an uninhabited desert, to satisfy a desolate wasteland, and to make it sprout with grass." So here we can see that God cares for creation, independent of whether or not it benefits humanity, but simply for itself. And similarly, this relationship between God and the non-human creation is evident in Psalm 104, which I know has been mentioned a number of times today, and I'd really encourage you to have a read of it, where the beauty and the goodness of the non-human creation is celebrated, and humans are mentioned as just one of many members of creation that look to God for life and to sustenance. And finally, as humanity, we too inevitably have a relationship with the non-human creation. And this relationship is important. It matters deeply because of our relationship with God and that independent relationship that God has with creation outside of us. So in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, as we heard this morning, humanity is uniquely made in the image of God. It also describes us as being given the extraordinary responsibility to rule over and to take care of the non-human creation in a way that reflects and emulates God himself in the servant kingship that Jesus exemplified. In Genesis chapter 2:15, which is familiar from today, it says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to take care of it." And as Tim said, here the Hebrew word for work can be translated to mean serve, and the words for take care can also imply keeping or guarding or protecting. So the picture here the Bible paints in Genesis is one where the relationship between human and non-human is of mutuality and reliance. We are to nurture creation. This is, of course, not to worship creation, but to appreciate it and to serve it. So this triangle demonstrates that our world is not anthropocentric, nor is it ecocentric, but rather the whole of creation, both human and non-human, is theocentric, in direct relationship with our Creator. So in Genesis chapter 3, we read that these relationships have been broken in the fall. They continue to exist, but they become imperfect, more challenging, and in need of redemption. And as humanity, we can recognize that we are not in right relationship with God or the non-human creation. We, as image bearers of God, are not acting in responsibility for the creation we're to care for. And this is evident in so many parts of our lives. Seeking to redeem the relationship between humanity and the non-human creation entails thinking carefully about how our actions impact on the non-human creation. This includes how we treat animals, the enormous rate of plastic pollution that is choking our oceans, our use of cheap flights, and the all too slow uptake of renewable energy solutions, to name just a few. But particularly we're focusing on the way in our food systems, that is how and what we eat, does not care for the environment. In fact, we are destroying large parts of the non-human creation through the way that we choose to produce our food. So since the Industrial Revolution and the rise of urbanization, how we eat has begun to change. From snacking, eating out, the constant supply of fresh fruit, microwaves, ordering food via phones, all of these different aspects of eating has changed and it's increased a disconnection between us and the non-human creation. The rhythms of meals at regularly observed times and a recognition of a broadly shared and localized diet has changed greatly. How, when, where and what we eat differs hugely, even from the way our grandparents or great-grandparents ate. This generation is also unique as, for the first time in history, we no longer have to hunt our food, but our food has begun to hunt us. Food advertisements surround us all the time, whether that is online, on TV, on billboards, on buses, and so on. Advertisements have been shown to work, and they increase our food consumption almost always of highly processed foods like Coca-Cola. Urbanization and the Industrial Revolution has also meant that we as humanity have increased the brokenness of the connection that we have with the non-human creation, either deliberately or unknowingly, and we have separated ourselves from the production methods and those who produce our food. So, how many of us can actually number foods which are native to our countries? Who can tell me what food is in season right now? How many native herbs or fungi can we actually identify? How many of us truly know what last year's harvest was really like? The broken relationship between us and the non-human creation is so evident in our food systems, and the commodification of food has distanced us from knowing and understanding how and where our food is produced and processed. And as eaters, we often don't recognize the food under our noses. So, to help us think about this, you may have noticed when you were next door having your tea and coffee, there were 2 additions to the usual biscuits. And these were 2 particular cakes that had labels on them to provide you with information about the ingredients that went into the food. So these were made to provide you, as the consumer, with more information about the food that you were eating to make it more easier to identify. So it may not be immediate obvious as when we eat day to day, but what we consume connects us intimately to the non-human creation, even if these connections are unseen and unknown to the most of us. So we wanted to actually ask you, what factors played a part in your decision-making process when you make choices about food? And what part did the labels, if indeed any, play? So I'm going to ask you a number of questions. You have to raise your hand, like in school, if there's anything that you considered when you're choosing your food. So first off, flavour. Did you have a go-to cake that you chose out of habit, something you fancied in the moment? Yes. Excellent. Health. Did anyone make their decisions based on the nutritional content of the food? Oh, impressive. Great. And what about ingredients? Did it matter to you that the products contain local ingredients or non-local ingredients? Slightly less. How the products were produced. Did you notice any ethical labels, such as fair trade, or would you usually think about the people who are involved in the production process? Yeah, a few. Great. As you can maybe tell from these questions, it is a very complicated decision, and it can be a challenge to hold all these concerns about food in your head all at once. But starting to ask these kind of questions can really help us reconnect to the non-human creation upon which we depend for our daily food. And this is what we call thoughtful eating. We are perhaps the most ignorant eaters that the world has ever known. We are not thoughtful, but we are thoughtless, and we are unable to recognize the food sitting in front of us. And as such, we argue that we have an impoverished food imagination because we have decontextualized food by treating it as a commodity. So take, for example, the humble brownie. A brownie is a collection of fairly common household ingredients: flour, eggs, cocoa powder, butter, and chocolate mixed together, baked for about half an hour depending on the recipe. You might add nuts for a crunch, or chunks of white chocolate to add texture. The brownie is a crowd favourite, but there's more to it than meets the eye. All the food served here have their own food stories which go beyond those who've made it. The story goes from soil to plants to animals to people, and there's a much deeper story behind food than we often realise. So, first, take the soil. The health of soil and the methods of agricultural cultivation that go into the tilling and tending of it have a huge impact on the sustainability of the produce. A brownie contains wheat grown by farmers to grind into flour. The wheat then becomes flour, remind us of our dependence on the soil from which it grew and our dependence on the land for sustenance. Soil is arguably the most complex ecosystem that we have on Earth, and takes approximately 500 years, some say longer, to form 1 centimetre of soil. And 1 gram of soil contains 1,000 million individual bacteria belonging to thousands of species. Soil is precious and fragile, and through soil we have the basis for growing wheat. Wheat is dependent on the soil, and by extension, so are the paper bags of processed flour that lines our shop shelves. Then we move on to plants. Plants are grown to make these ingredients, and they can often seem like a lesser life form than animals and human beings, but have you ever tried to keep a plant alive? It is a delicate process, and it takes time and expertise. It takes care and thoughtful stewardship. Animals. Butter and eggs are usual tenants in most of our fridges. We spread butter on toast, we bake it into cakes, and we sometimes even use it to fry vegetables. We enjoy eggs, fried, scrambled, boiled, all the time. But how often do we stop to think about the animals from which butter and eggs came from? In the brownie, we used British butter. Butter should be traced back to the cow, and the design of the animal which provides us with these amazing things, which also provides us with the milk used for some of the other choices on offer. And what about eggs? How often do we stop to think about the process of the egg taken from the chicken? How that one simple thing has been adapted for so many delightful food choices. Both cows and chickens are intelligently designed by a loving creator, and as humans, we can't produce dairy products or eggs, and we have to rely on the non-human creation, particularly animals, for these things. Part of eating thoughtfully is recognizing the relationship between humans and animals is one of mutual interdependence, and so our food systems ought to care for and treat animals with respect. And finally, we come to people. We are connected in relationships, and this is so important with food. Our food systems have a huge capacity for injustice. This eco-label, which may have been the most familiar to you when you looked at the food, is the Fair Trade logo. When we make brownies, we have to incorporate chocolate and cocoa powder. If we don't, they lose their essential character. The process which brings the cocoa bean to the form of the chocolate bar you find in your local shop is a complicated feat of human effort and godly provision. It's also a way in which some of the most vulnerable producers are treated unjustly. Fair trade is about better prices, decent working conditions, local sustainability, and fair terms of trade for farmers and workers in low-income countries. By requiring companies to pay sustainable prices, fair trade addresses the injustice of conventional trades, which traditionally discriminates against the poorest and the weakest. In this way, the chocolate found in the brownies profoundly connects us in relationship to humanity. The brownie is a fairly simple cake. There's nothing specialist or overly technical about the processes or indeed the ingredients, but it has an enduring appeal and delicious flavour. This is just an example of how we eat every day, and what we have eaten already connects us with the soil, with the plants and animals, and with each other, with the most economically vulnerable and our global neighbours. We put the labels beside your food to help eliminate some of these themes, to help get the ball rolling on how we can be more thoughtful and the implications of what we're eating. So, as we've covered, we all participate in the food system, both globally and locally. These systems are not caring for or nurturing the non-human creation. They have damaged, they are damaging, and to a greater extent will continue to damage much of the non-human creation. And so I know we've covered some of these already, but I want to touch on just a few key areas where our food systems are damaging the environment and having major consequences on people. So, first is water. Water is necessary for all human activity, and when it's threatened, it threatens lives and livelihoods. Agriculture represents 70% of the world's freshwater use. And you can see in this figure here, the blue represents agriculture. Since 1960s, our water consumption has more than doubled. This is largely due to the expansion of agriculture, which threatens both plants and animals. Our food systems threaten 80% of animal and bird species at a rate that is 100 to 1,000 times greater than pre-industrial levels. And you can see this on the Global Planet Index. You can see this is tracking 3,670 species. And you see from 1970, these have declined by almost half. Our food systems are also polluting the environment. It causes vast amounts of serious and long-term damage to plants and animals. 95% of all our food is produced in the soil, but a third of all land is categorized as highly degraded due to acidification, over-irrigation, and poor fertilizer management. Pollution also seeps into our waterways, killing plants and animals that live there and creating dead zones. Our food systems are also producing vast amounts of waste. Farmland the size of China, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan combined is used to grow food that is never actually eaten. And this is a huge waste, not only of land and water resources, but also of pollution and human effort. It's estimated that 1/3 of all our food produced is either lost or wasted. And this is particularly shocking given that 821 million people are undernourished. And even in higher income countries, like here in England, in the east of England, 150,000 people received emergency food parcels from food banks, and that's only since Christmas. This is a fundamental misuse of resources that shows a huge lack of respect for our God-given responsibility to the environment, as well as all the human actors along the supply chain. And finally, as Tim mentioned, greenhouse gases. Our food systems are having serious long-term effects on the environment as they release high levels of greenhouse gas emissions. The warming of our planet is changing weather patterns. It makes natural disasters such as hurricanes and floods more severe. It threatens food security, and it increases the number of pests and disease. As the US Army describes it, the warming of the planet is a threat multiplier. And you can see here that within global greenhouse gas emissions, food represents 26%, but of that 26%, animal products represents 58%. And so I've talked a bit generally about our food systems, but I want to look specifically at livestock and dairy because they are the most resource-intensive parts of our food system. So livestock takes up a vast amount of land. In the EU alone, 2/3 of all arable land is used to grow crops for livestock, which is an inefficient use of resources. As Brendan said, animal products require significantly more water than plant-based products, and this is almost entirely due to the water needed for animal feed. So producing 1 kilogram of crops takes an average of 300 to 2,000 litres of water. But to produce 1 kilogram of red meat, this can take anywhere between 30 to 50 times more water. Livestock alone accounts for 14.5% of the total greenhouse gas emissions, of which methane, which cows and sheep produce, has 10 times the power of CO2. Meat consumption is also increasing globally. So you can see here places in China and Brazil have rocketed in their meat consumption, and this is largely because meat consumption is correlated largely to wealth, and this is unsustainable largely because these are also the countries where population has increased massively in recent years. So it's very clear that our food systems do not care for the non-human creation. It does not nurture plants or animals or even people, and we are not fulfilling our roles as servant kings in the way God has called us to. And it's destroying soil, it's killing species, and it's making our most vulnerable neighbours, both globally and locally, even more vulnerable. But as we've heard, the Bible does address how we are to treat the non-human creation, and specifically in food. There is a theology of food that is woven throughout the Bible that paints a better vision for that relationship and how we choose to eat and build our food systems. And I'm going to pass over to Hannah, who's going to tell us about that theology of food.
All right. Okay. Okay, so that's the situation. The science is clear. The cost of our food systems flow directly into our environment, into our river, into our soils, and into our food. So what we need to do is we need to expand our food imagination. Our food systems need to not only nourish us as eaters, but they also need to nourish and care for the soil, the plants, the animals, and the people involved at all of the stages of the food production. When we eat, even eating a simple brownie, we, by necessity, enter into a web of relationships. We cannot avoid this. However, we can eat faultlessly, simply eating without ever truly tasting. So we need far more than just the story of the brownie to help us move towards changing how we eat and reforming our food systems. When we set out to explore this topic, we thought that it would be really good to look at the questions of the environment and the food systems through a biblical lens, because we believe the Bible has profound relevance for public life, because we have been at the Jubilee Centre for 10 months, and that is what they tell you. And you guys all know it too now, because you've all done it. From all of the biblical texts about food and eating, two key themes emerged: delighting in food and sharing food. We have been convinced that there is a higher vision for food. It is not simply a manufactured product that we control, but it is in God's love made delicious and nutritious, given for the good of each other. It is God's intention that we receive food as an expression of his love that he has for humanity, in a provision of sustenance and nutrition. And it is a gift of delicious and joyful food that we can delight in. This reality demands a response of gratitude. But food was also created for sharing. This speaks to hospitality, meals with others, fellowship enjoyed over a dinner table. It is also about social justice. The biblical vision is for everyone to be able to enjoy delicious food. This means that our food systems ought to play a role in providing food for all. We need to combat the injustice in our food systems, whether it is in the workers being exploited, the environmental degradation which affects the most poor and vulnerable. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about delighting in food. Food is a great gift given to us by God. This perspective on food helps us to truly enjoy and savour eating. As I said, our response ought to be one of gratitude to God for making eating possible, but also to the non-human creation, to the soil, plants and animals which all contribute to this. This means that part of delighting in food is delighting in God's creation, which also means, as we've explored a lot today, respecting and caring the environment upon which we depend. God's concern for his creation and his people is wonderfully expressed by our favourite psalm, which you've seen maybe 4 or 5 times already today, but it's great. Psalm 104, a poetic meditation about God's creation. He makes grass grow for the cattle and plants for people to cultivate, bringing forth food from the earth, wine that gladdens human hearts, oil to make their faces shine, and bread that sustains their hearts. We see in this psalm that delighting in food is part of God's creational design. We also see that God has a profound concern for food systems and the sustaining of his creation. Humans and animals are placed side by side in this psalm. In contrast to this, however, current food systems do not help us delight in food. As Katherine mentioned, we have decontextualized food and become disconnected from the reality of food production. People eat today with a diminished sense of the depth and breadth of relationships that constitute a food item. And this narrowing leads us to a limited sense of sympathy or care for fields, animals, and farmers. Delighting in food fully means thinking about all of the aspects of eating. An important part of recontextualizing food is the reality of life and death. Eating is a daily reminder of our creaturely mortality. We live to eat, knowing that without food we will starve and die. But to eat, we must also kill, realizing that without the death of others, microbes, insects, plants and animals, we can have no food. For us to eat, plants and animals have to die. We have to acknowledge this. Our response ought to be one of humility. How can we behave and eat in a way that respects our fellow creatures? How can our food systems produce food that nurtures us, but also nurtures this non-human creation? And food is precious for so many reasons. Because of the death involved in the food production, and because of the human effort that goes into producing food, but ultimately because it points us back to a divine creator and sustainer. Unfortunately, our current food systems are characterized by reckless ingratitude. By contrast, the biblical authors encourage us to rejoice and thank God for food. So, think about Jesus feeding the 5,000. During his ministry, Jesus often preached to large crowds. Evening was approaching. The people had been listening to Jesus for a long time. The disciples came to Jesus and they said, "This is a remote place and it's getting late." They suggested, "Send the crowds away so they may go to the villages and buy themselves some food." But Jesus replied, "They don't need to go away. You can give them something to eat." The disciples were confused. They said, "We only have here 5 loaves and 2 fish." So Jesus said, "Bring these things to me." He told the crowd to sit, and he took that 5 loaves and those 2 fish, and he looked up to heaven, and to God he expressed gratitude for this food, and he broke the loaves. He then gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. Everyone ate, and they were all satisfied, and the disciples collected the leftovers. Jesus fed over 5,000 people that day with only 5 loaves and 2 fish. So there are a few things we can learn from this very well-known story. First of all, God provides food for people to enjoy. Here he did it directly through Jesus' ministry, but he does it all the time through his creation. And this was a totally unexpected miracle. I think we can be sure that the people eating the food were amazed and enjoyed their impromptu picnic. But secondly, Jesus gave thanks to God for this provision, even when it was still small. He showed profound gratitude for food. And a final point, he valued the food. He instructed the disciples to gather up the leftovers and no food was wasted. Eating, characterized by ingratitude, fails to see beyond one's own plate. But true delighting recognizes that food is always a gift from God. And Christians have followed Jesus' example for over 2,000 years by saying grace, a prayer of thanks to God before a meal. This is perhaps the most habitual way of expressing gratitude to God for food, for creation, and for his people. It demonstrates contemplation as God is asked to bless the hands that prepared the meal. But remembering the triangle of relationships, we do not only give thanks to the people who prepared the food in our kitchen, but to all the other people along the supply chain. And not only that, we also give thanks to the ecosystems that make eating possible. Saying grace can help us understand that we are dependent on God, on other people, and on non-human creation, and help us have a response of humility, responsibility, and celebration. Psalm 34 encourages us to taste and see that the Lord is good. This is not just a metaphor. This is referring to a real physical tasting, a delight in God's good gift of food.
So you can see on our slide here our 2 key themes of delighting and sharing. Hannah's taken you through delighting, so I'm going to briefly talk you through why sharing is important. Food was designed by God for sharing with others, and eating together is common to all cultures and is thought to have communal, relational and personal benefits. And studies have shown correlations between eating meals together and self-reported happiness, life satisfaction and engagement with the local community. And the significance of eating together is well expressed by a biblical proverb. Better a small serving of vegetables with love than a fattened calf with hatred. So what this proverb shows us really is that it's the relationships and the people you're eating with that matter more than the quality of the meal, whether it's a restaurant dish or a simple meal of pasta cooked at home. Who we eat with is really important in our society, but it was even more important in first century Palestine during Jesus' lifetime. Meals expressed social status and boundaries between different ethnic and religious groups. But as Tim mentioned, Jesus' ministry was characterized by his table fellowship, his eating and drinking with other people. And what was unusual about his table fellowship was that it was radically inclusive and therefore subversive of those social boundaries that other people expected him to respect. And Jesus was actually accused of being a glutton and a drunkard because he was so well known for enjoying food around a table with other people. He didn't behave like a Jewish rabbi should have. He ate with people like tax collectors, and he went to the houses of both the elite and the marginalised, rich and poor, religious and irreligious. Jesus welcomed everyone into his new kingdom community, and actually his eating and drinking with all different types of people were some of the most controversial ways in which he did so. And Luke describes it like this in his gospel: the Son of Man came eating and drinking. That's how important sharing food was for Jesus. Another important aspect is the common cultural feature of food, which is feasting. So at feasts, people prepare and eat food together as part of communal celebrations, so developing and strengthening relationships. And of course, delighting and sharing, these two themes that we're drawing out, are intertwined. In the Old Testament, the Israelites are commanded to bring their whole family together and to eat the produce of their land with joy as a celebration before God. And think about that, they're actually commanded to come together and eat with joy and rejoice. So this is not optional, they're commanded to eat a meal together. For citizens of higher income countries like ours in the UK, this special nature of celebratory eating has rather been lost because of the overabundance of food. When every day is a virtual feast, we lose the blessing of a real one. So a real contrast between simple, everyday eating and feasts is the biblical pattern, and one that could actually help us delight in both. We've explored here in brief some of the ways food is inherently relational, but when it comes to sharing food, we also have to think about social justice. Human society currently has two contradictory problems with food. So there are about 650 million people in the world who are obese, but there are also about 821 million people who are undernourished, who don't have enough food to eat. And these are both issues of social justice. This is obvious for those who don't have enough food, but for people in countries like the UK, obesity is correlated to poverty, and this is because we've constructed food systems that supply an excess amount of unhealthy foods at cheap prices. So these aren't easy problems to fix, but we need to take them seriously because the principle of sharing food as part of social justice is inherent in the character of God. Through his creation, he provides delicious and nutritious food, and he cares especially for the poor and vulnerable. Throughout biblical law, the Israelites are commanded to care for the poor, and sharing food with the poor and the vulnerable is one of the most obvious and concrete expressions that the Israelites were commanded to do. Jesus' meals conveyed a similar message about social justice. He taught that the poor and the marginalised should be invited to meals. And his disciples in the early church quickly became well known for their radically ordinary hospitality, their sharing of life together through meals, and their care for the poor, especially by giving them food. The way food systems currently damage the environment, as Katherine spoke about earlier, affects us all, but it has particularly serious consequences for the vulnerable and the marginalised, the global poor, as well as future generations who don't have a voice.
And we, as part of our project, have really become passionate about food. So as part of that is that one of my hobbies is watching documentaries about food. And this was one by Michael Pollan called Cooked. I very much recommend it. It's really great. But this clip really struck me because it shows us how spirituality and physical embodied reality are complementary, which was something Brendan touched on earlier. The interdependence of humanity and this non-human creation, as Norman Wurzba, a famous if you're as niche as us, theologian looking at food and faith, mentions in an interview we conducted with him, we cannot live as isolated individuals. And this is particularly obvious when we look at microbiology. The idea of self-subsistence, he says, is called into question because each organism is constituted for its relationships. To be is to be in relationship. And as Sister Noella does, how can we look at the intelligently designed world and think it is not for Christians to engage with. So we've looked a lot, as I mentioned, at theologians, particularly Norman Wurzba, but this is not an idea that is exclusive to religious writers. So the well-known writer Michael Pollan touches on it, and so do others. And they look at food and they see something that we know to be foundational to the world. They see relationships. So we have another clip. If my IT guy can...
Astonishing realization that we have to think about not just feeding our cells, but feeding all those other cells that we move through life together with. When you look at food, whether it's kimchi or chocolate, it's not just a thing, it's not just a product, it's a relationship with other species in nature. And it's far too easy to forget that now. The food chain is so long and so opaque, and kimchi comes in a jar, bread comes in a wrapper, but all these things involve these quasi-miraculous engagements with the natural world. Human ingenuity over tens of thousands of years, learning how to transform the gifts of nature into these achievements of culture. And that's what cooking is.
So, exactly, right? We have decontextualized food. So we no longer understand the long and hugely complicated food chains that take us from the farmer through to our plates. And Michael Pollan touches on this when he says that the plastic packaging and the kimchi coming in jars showed us that we can eat without a full appreciation for what food is. But he also talks about it being quasi-miraculous. Well, we know that it is not quasi-miraculous, it was fully miraculous, because it's a grace gift. And we can see these writers recognizing the importance of relationships in food, but from a Christian perspective, we know that our current food systems, when contrasted with a biblical vision for food and the environment, fall so short. We can see how human sin has distorted our relationships. So Andrew's going to come up here and just tell you a little bit about what we can do then in response to that.
Yeah, so I'm going to rattle through some applications. This is going to be an abbreviated version, so do look at the executive summary of the paper that you've got, and the full book will also be published online, so you can read lots more there. Okay, the problems we've highlighted will require action, accountability, and responsibility at all levels of society, and so we want to explore some of the key applications from our paper. So our key application for individuals is hinted at with our title for this event, Thoughtful Eating. But what do we mean when we say this? Well, thoughtful eating reminds us that there is no human fellowship without a table, no table without a kitchen, no kitchen without a garden, no garden without viable ecosystems, no ecosystems without the forces productive of life, and no life without its source in God. Thoughtful eating places us in the context of our food systems and shows us that we are part of creation and are accountable to God, to each other, and to the environment upon which we depend. So thoughtful eating requires knowledge of the processes that bring food to the plate, appreciation, gratitude, delight, and includes a fuller tasting, smelling, and savouring of food. Eating thoughtfully means putting care and attention into looking at the environmental context of how food is grown, and the social context of the production processes it went through to get to our tables. And this means thinking about the web of relationships we discussed when looking at the brownie. So think about asking some of those questions that Katherine encouraged us to think through earlier. Becoming more familiar with these aspects of food can help us have more care and appreciation for the soil, plants, animals, and people woven throughout our food systems. Take your favourite food, perhaps, and spend time learning about it. Think about where the ingredients came from, how it was produced, who was involved. And this can be a process that is both informative but also delightful. It will enable you to appreciate the food in a whole new light. Cooking is a great opportunity. In countries like the UK, we often have the choice as to whether we cook or not, because we can buy food from shops that's ready made. So choosing to cook is a really good option for engaging with food more fully and experiencing how those different ingredients combine and create different flavours. To try growing some of your own food if you have space and time. This is a great way of remembering that all food comes from God's creation. Even if that's a herb on a windowsill, we'd really encourage you to try at least growing one plant for food. So this leads us on to the topic that is in the media a lot. What dietary changes should we make to support the environment? So veganism is often highlighted as the best diet from an environmental perspective, and this is quite fair because it avoids meat and dairy products. As Katherine mentioned, those have the highest environmental impacts. Nevertheless, a vegan diet does have environmental impacts, so you still have to think about it. Almond milk is a good example, which contributes directly to water shortages in California, where 82% of the world's almonds are grown. So it doesn't solve all your problems. And it's also quite a radical diet, and it can be kind of complicated for people to adopt. So we suggest a flexitarian diet as a simpler lifestyle change. And flexitarianism merely means reducing your meat consumption, so eating a mainly vegetarian diet with meat sometimes. And we recommend kind of once to twice a week as being a good aim to get there. But if you're currently eating meat most days, perhaps go for one day meat-free, for example, as a good start. And if you want an easy kind of rule of thumb to remember, we really like Michael Pollan's line, which you just saw Michael Pollan speaking there. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And in 7 words, that's pretty good. And a useful way of thinking about this that we've suggested is to adopt the principle of meat for celebrations. So if you go back to what we discussed when we looked at feasting, in the past, such as in biblical eras, this was the experience of the vast majority of people. You only ate meat occasionally at feasts, at celebrations, because the rest of the time you couldn't afford to. But actually keeping meat for celebrations provides encouragement and motivation to buy higher quality meat from perhaps a local or independent butcher. And this can also be expensive to do regularly, which is another good reason for eating it less often and paying more when you do, which is something Brendan mentioned earlier. Another key part of the discussion about dietary changes are the twin ideas of eating seasonally and locally. Food that is both local and seasonal is a good option for the environment, but eating food that is one or the other has the potential to do more harm than good. But this is complicated, so let me explain. Eating locally is often paired with the concept of food miles. This can be slightly confusing because this is not directly correlated to environmental impact necessarily. So, for example, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, consuming lettuce grown in the UK in the summer is good. But during the winter, it's actually better environmentally to eat lettuce grown in Spain. Because if it's grown in the UK, it relies on fossil fuel-based heating and lighting. And so even with the transportation from Spain taken into account, it's still better environmentally to eat lettuce grown in Spain in the winter. So that's why, but however, you can avoid these problems and kind of complications if you don't have time to calculate the impacts of lettuce by eating both seasonally and locally. Because that makes sure that it's being grown in a natural way, not relying on fossil fuels, and also grown locally so it's not travelling a long distance. And this also it has opportunities to support local farmers, the local economy, engage with people perhaps at a farmer's market, that kind of thing. These are all great opportunities to build relationships in a local context. And finally, as individuals, we also have to address food waste. We've already said food waste is a huge problem. The average UK household loses £470 per year due to food waste, and as you can see, 70% of food in the UK is wasted at a household level. So it's something that individuals really have to grapple with and take responsibility for. Food waste represents a huge waste of resources, does not show gratitude to God for his provision of food, nor does it respect the non-human creation upon which we rely for food and for life. So practical steps to reduce food waste may include buying less to start with, planning meals ahead of time, storing and eating leftovers. And yes, I will leave it there and pass on to Hannah to think a bit more about what we can do with organisations, I'm sniffing up, and policy.
It's a wonky veg. You should eat wonky veg. That's all I'm going to say. But we also have to think beyond individuals. We are social reformers summer school after all, and we have to think about reforming systems as well. So we began today with a challenge to you. We placed labels beside the cakes to provide you with some information about the choices you made. But something we'd like to see happen is more widespread eco-labelling, in the style of mandatory nutritional information, which would allow for a clear comparison between products and make sure that companies show and publicise how they are used. So this is a proposed example of what eco-labelling on food products could look like. It's just a suggestion at this stage, but it's the type of thing we'd like to see happen. This would be a very complicated thing to achieve. Since eco-labelling is so much more complicated to calculate than the nutritional information, and it would also present a challenge to small-scale producers and businesses, but the current system, unfortunately, does not present a clear picture to you as consumers. So it would be helpful, we think, to provide consumers with some information. However, we think it's really important to say that consumers only have limited agency. Sometimes it is very difficult to know what's a good choice, so we have to address how food is produced through farms and agribusiness. So Tim spoke to us about farms, so I'm going to keep this quite brief, but it's a central way and a central thing that we have to grapple with if we want to reform our food systems. Something that we think is really important is supporting our farmers in a move towards a sustainable future. Oftentimes the public debate the public conversation is put up as environmentalists versus farmers, and this is really unhelpful. We have mentioned already that there's a vocation for all humanity to care for the environment. Farmers are at the front lines of this and the most physically connected to the soil. We want to support them in this work as stewards of the land, and this is something consumers should be thoughtful of as part of thoughtful eating. We acknowledge that this might result in higher prices in some instances. We would say it's important if we're going to recognise the value of food and farming. So more sustainable farming could result in higher food prices, is what I mean. We've driven down food prices, but this has resulted in a lot of negative consequences, and in fact, there are a lot of hidden costs to which we're not paying for. So Ruth Valerio talks about this in her book Ella's for Lifestyle, and says that there are 3 reasons for all to treat food. First, subsidies which favour intensive farming over small-scale organic farming. 2, external costs that are not paid for, or if they are paid for by the taxpayer, they're paid for by the taxpayers. And thirdly, we expect food to be very cheap. The amount of money we spend on food has decreased considerably over the last 50 years. About 9% of spending by UK citizens on food is spent on food eaten at home. If the environment thrives, so will a farmer's crops or livestock. However, unless environmentally sustainable farming is financially viable, a farmer will be unable to make a living in this way. So something we're going to talk about, but we've run out of time, is taxation, subsidies and governance. So I'm sure you're all devastated to know I'm not going to talk to you about CAP, but something that we're really excited about is, bear with me. I've got it. The National Food Strategy. I find it. We were really excited to learn that last month the Department for the Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs are undertaking a major rethink of the sector. So in June 2019, DEFRA announced a major review of the UK food system. This will investigate the entire food system in what they call from field to fork, and examine the interlocking issues of agriculture, environment, health and business. Recommendations put forward by this review will result in a new national food strategy to be published in 2020. We think that this is an excellent opportunity to take a holistic approach to the issues raised in our talk, in our book, and throughout today. As we said, we want the principles of sustainability and justice. These 2 things are so important to us, and we would hope that they would be at the heart of this national food strategy. So we're going to skip the CAP, so you can come ask me about that later if you want. But if you want to engage more of our research, There are copies of the executive summary in your little packets. So please do take time to look at that and to quiz us about it. On the back, you're going to find a link to a page on the Jubilee website called Thoughtful Eating. There you'll find lots of resources that we find really helpful in researching this topic, including blogs, podcasts. Now this is exciting. We've been working on for the last few months a podcast series looking at eating thoughtfully, and we have Caroline Lucas, who's the director of Climate Stewards, talking to us about the environment. We have Norman Worspa, our favourite theologian on food and faith, who's absolutely lovely, and Ruth Valerio, who's really great at getting into the nitty-gritty of how we should respond as Christians and individuals. So yeah, they're going to be really great interviews, so I really encourage you to look for that whenever it's up. We also have videos, books, recipes, and when our full research is published, it will be available on that page. If you sign up for the Jubilee Centre emailing list, which you will probably find over there, or you can talk to Mercedes, or you're probably in it already, yeah, thanks. You can find, you'll be notified when it's published. But if you're also if you're interested in specific topics, ask us in a minute in the Q&A. Bam. When we began thinking about what topic we wanted to explore for our research, we spent a lot of time thinking about it. We were drawn towards this issue because we felt that it was the issue for our generation to grapple with. During today, we've considered some of the key environmental and social impacts of the food we eat. God designed his creation to be good, and he declared it as good, and it is good, especially because it provides us with the food we need to eat, as well as so many other good things. We have a vocation to care for it, which we must take seriously. This matters because, as we've said about 100 billion times, we live in relationship, with God, with the non-human creation, and with the people we share the earth with. So, it's been said that there are two things in life we can be sure of: death and taxes. However, as food writer B. Wilson has said, this is not quite true, is it? There are many people who are actually quite good at avoiding tax. The saying should perhaps then be, the only things in life we can be sure of is death and food. Both are natural and sure, even if you seek to avoid it. Food is a necessity for life. Food unites us, inspires us. We eat at weddings, we eat at funerals. We bring food to the bereaved, we have fellowship around tables, and we eat as families. Food is innately and beautifully human. It is also symptomatic of a fallen world. We have taken something joyful and not delighted in it, but eaten it without thought. We have not shared it, but we have kept it to ourselves. We guard our hearths on our tables, while Jesus ate with social outcasts and the broken. We have transformed eating with technology and ended up in a place where we have lonely eaters and a food industry which does irreparable damage to the environment upon which we rely for life. However, we also have hope. There is a higher vision for eating and for food, which seeks to use food as a way to bridge divisions in communities, as a way of bringing joy and pleasure and delight to the eater, as a way of strengthening family and community, as a way of respecting the environment and living out the radical openness and community of Jesus. We need to honour God by caring for his planet and loving our neighbours, not only today but for generations to come, and not only our next door neighbours but our global neighbours. As Paul wrote to Timothy, God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. We must take action because we have a power to act. We must love because eating enables us to experience a divine love which calls for our love in return. And we must challenge ourselves to recognise the truth of this situation and make thoughtful decisions because we have sound mind. Changing our perspective on food and eating is a fundamental way to work towards right and just relationships with God, with each other, and with the non-human creation.